Hey everyone, today's video we're going to be doing something a bit different. I wanted to take some time to step back from the Material UI tutorials on actual components and make a video addressing some of the most popular questions I get about Material UI on my channel, as well as, in my opinion, what the best way for you to learn Material UI is. If you find value in this video, please consider subscribing, leaving a comment, liking. I literally live off of your guys' comments. I try to read every single one of them to get suggestions, ideas, and I really appreciate all the love and feedback that you guys are giving me, so thank you so much for all of that. Now, the first thing that I get the most is a lot of people that are trying to learn Material UI for either two different reasons, and they want to know the best way to go about it. The first reason is you have been given a project and you have to use Material UI for it, whether it's for school or for work. And the second reason is you just want to become a better programmer and you heard that Material UI is great for learning with React and you want to get into it. Now, in both of these situations, there are a couple different things you can do, but if you are in the camp where you are just trying to sort of learn Material UI from scratch, here is what I would recommend for you guys first. If you Google Material UI different examples and something like websites made with Material UI, you can see that there are a ton of different websites that you can sort of emulate and see that are made with it. For example, on Material UI they have a showcase, and a lot of these showcases are sort of just sites that are custom built, but a lot of them are real sites. For example, Trade MBA. If we go ahead and click on that, you can see that this is a real site. People visit this site. It has a bunch of different information on it, and what I would try to do is I would try to pick a page, because obviously you can't remake the whole entire site unless you really wanted to and you had a lot of time in your hands. But pick one of the pages and in your mind try to visually sort of understand what components we have here. So for example, we can clearly see this would be an app bar and a toolbar component to create this header. This is just a drop down with a menu. We can see here's another menu. They have night mode, which I've explained in one of my videos, how to add dark mode to your website. We can scroll down, we can see these are pretty easy examples of cards, and you can see everything sort of in a grid format. So I would highly recommend just going to one of these sites. You can even go to, for example, some of the Material UI templates that they have online, for example, the blog template, and try to just recreate this, if not in your head, by mapping out the components mentally. Then I would even recommend trying to build it from scratch and try to make it look as close as possible. And the cool thing about the templates is that once you have built your version, you can then download and look at the source code for the version that you copied. So for example, this blog, and you can see how they split up their components and how they made it. And it's worth noting that not all of these are sort of best practice on how to create these templates. Not all the code you're going to see here is best practice and you should copy to a T, but it's still extremely good practice. Now, the next thing you should pay attention to if you are someone that's building this for work or you already have a project in mind that you want to do, is that once you sort of map out the sort of mental aspect of your site. So for example, I did this in one of my other sites, but what I'll do is I'll literally break the page down in Paint or something like that. I'll show everything I want on the page and how I want the page to look, and then I will literally have like what I'll do is I'll go through the entire site and I'll break down the components. So for example, if I have a header, if I have some cards, if I had like a section or a container with a typography header and maybe some brief typography, you should definitely break the site down that you want to build just like that and go through the Material UI documentation and sort of just get a feel for all the components. They don't have too many components, so you can get through it pretty briefly and pretty fast. You can just go from component to component, sort of understanding what each component is. And once you have a good idea of that, you can mentally build a website in your head. And once you have the mental build of the website in your head, it's really easy to translate that into code if you have a bit of experience. And if you don't, it's a perfect time to build experience. Another thing I want to talk about while we're here looking at the components is a lot of people before I started the components tutorials, were very confused about grid. And even after I made my grid tutorials, I still get some questions about it. And the majority of the questions comes down to essentially knowing how Flexbox works. If you're going to be learning Material UI, I highly recommend doing a quick 30-minute tutorial on how Flexbox, which is just general CSS, a library for CSS that was made a long time ago that is sort of built into a lot of different UI libraries, works. And the way I learned is from a site called Flexbox Froggy. So if you just Google Flexbox Froggy, you'll see this is it. And it's literally a 24 level game where they have this really nice visual explanation of how Flexbox works. I highly recommend this for anyone starting Material UI, even before you get started. Even if you're new to React or anything like that, this is pure CSS understanding, and it'll really help you understand how grid works under the hood, and which in turn really helps when you're sort of designing how you want your sites to work. Now, another question I want to address from a lot of comments I get on, and I'll just even pull up the first video here. If you scroll down, you can see there are a lot of people that are sort of asking for one big project that uses the best practices and that uses a fake or any random API. I also get a lot of suggestions on doing a big, like, 3-hour video on creating an entire React application that uses Material UI that starts from, you know, the create React app all the way to implementing Material UI, all the way to adding Redux, Redux Saga, creating another project in Express for the backend, hooking them up, adding a database, and then deploying the whole thing. And I do think that video would add a lot of value, but a video like that, not only is it, I guess, really time intensive, and I'm sort of working on other stuff at the moment. I tried to do something similar to that in the Pokedex tutorials. If you want to see how to create a website sort of from scratch, implement it with a very basic API, this is like a really great starter project in my opinion. You can watch my Pokedex series, but other than that, that type of video I might do sometime in the future, but if I do it, it will come after I release a bunch of tutorials on standalone things like Redux, Redux Saga, React, Express, and hooking all of them up together. Which I wanted to ask if any of you guys have any suggestions in the comments. I'm thinking of sort of either slowing down on Material UI components because we've covered so much of them, and I'm sort of itching to do something new, but in the future I still want to be adding on Material UI components to the playlist now and then, but I just want to switch up the videos a bit. If you guys would be interested in seeing something like a brand new React 2020 and 2021 tutorial going over the best practices for React, I did do a React series a bit ago, and if you were to search up like React tutorial on YouTube, you'll see a lot of them are from 2 years and 1 year ago, and let me tell you, a ton of things have changed in that time, and React is sort of unrecognizable from some of the tutorials that you'll see here. In fact, a lot of the tutorials, I think, not to point any specific ones out, I haven't watched any of these tutorials, but a lot of the tutorials that are out right now deal with class-based components instead of hooks and functional-based components, and I think there would be a lot of value in maybe having a brand new React tutorial. And in that React tutorial, after I get over the basics of React, I would love to go over Redux, Redux Saga, which essentially lets you connect to a backend, and then maybe a brief Express tutorial that allows you to connect your front end to a backend, and then adding Material UI, creating a whole website, and then deploying it. So if that's something you'd like to see, leave it in the comments, let me know. And that sort of brings me to the next Material UI tip, which is if you are trying to learn Material UI from scratch, I would highly recommend, if you are going to build a full stack application to try and quote learn, don't try to learn too much at once, sort of bite off basic bits. I would first build the entire UI of the application you are building, and then once you have the UI down with Material UI, you should definitely look into maybe adding either an API or a backend, and that's sort of also what we did with the Pokedex series. Like I said before, the API sort of came last. We built the whole layout of everything before, and I give you guys a really good breakdown on how to use mock data to sort of fill up the data on your page without having that API connection. I know it was a blocker for me when I first tried to learn. Now, the next thing I highly recommend you guys learning, as you can see from a lot of my most recent videos, is how React Router works. Now, React Router, when I was learning it, it didn't really have I didn't find the documentation to be the best. I found it to be a bit confusing and a bit all over the place. There are a lot of good videos on React Router, but really you don't need to know too much. I would say just focus on the basics. So for example, if we come into their API, I would focus on the basics, like understanding how history works. I would understand how like location works, and just the basic nesting of the applications themselves. I think it's super important, especially because every single application is going to contain things like a header. It might contain a drawer. If you want to implement tabs, anything like that, or breadcrumbs, anything like that, it's pretty essential to know how React Router works. So I would, if I were you guys and I was just learning React Material UI from scratch, I would watch maybe like a 10 to 20 minute video on React Router just to have a brief idea. And in a lot of my tutorials, I actually go over how React Router works from scratch anyways, but it's still good to have that underlying information about what it is. And the same thing for Redux. If you are planning on using some of the more complex components, for example, Snackbar, a lot of that revolves around sort of Redux, and I think it's a really good idea to at least have an idea of what Redux is used for. And if you are still new to React and you don't really have a good idea of why anyone would use Redux or what it is in general, then maybe skip over some of those complex components for now and just try to make very basic applications with Material UI, so you get the general idea of it before moving into more extreme examples that might be a bit more complex. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is how to use the Material UI documentation, which I think a lot of people, before seeing some of the videos I put out, it was some feedback I got that a lot of people didn't really understand very well. And that is how to properly use the Material UI documentation. And it sounds pretty easy, but let me break it down for you guys that might be sort of new to Material UI. For each component, so you can see here, as soon as I go to the Material UI documentation, I can click this drawer and I can click components. There's two sections, components and components API. And those are probably where you'll be spending most of your time. Components, if you click on components, you will get an entire list of all these components. And in the difference between the two is this just general components category will show you examples of all the components in use. Then the components API tutorial, it will have almost all the same components, will show you the API documentation for every single one of those components. And let me show you how to use both of those in Tangent. So let's say, for example, I wanted to create let's say tabs. So I'll click on tabs under the components category, and you'll see here we have a lot of different examples of tabs. So for example, we have how to implement just some basic tab structure. And if you're not familiar with tab, it's just a component where you click one thing, you have these tabs, and whenever you click it, it will switch the view that the user sees. So you can nest anything in here. And it's really popular on websites. I'm sure you guys have seen it around. But you can see we have some basic examples, and then we have examples of different customizable props that they have. So for example, the disabled tab. So disabled is a prop that you can pass in to your tab component, and in this example they are just giving an example of a tab with the disabled prop. And Material UI will do that a lot in their documentation. If they have some props for components that are very commonly used, they will have examples of that component with those props being passed in. So for example, disabled, here's what it looks like with some other variants. So for example, if you take up full width, if you want to center your tabs in the middle, if you want to make these things scrollable, so for example, having a little carousel because you have so many tabs that you can scroll through it, and a lot of other things like having icons just for your tabs, etc., etc. And each, like I said, each component will have a different amount of examples depending on the amount of props and the complexity of the component itself. You even have an example of vertical tabs. I've never seen this before. This sort of just looks like a cheaper copy of drawer, but that's besides the point. Now, My favorite thing to do when I'm first learning a component, before I get to the API, I will go to this components view, look at the most simple example of the components, and I will either sort of look at the code that they provide here to understand it. You can click this button here to show the entire code that they have here for this component. Or what I recommend doing is you can click this edit button, and this will actually take you to a Code Sandbox link. If you're not familiar with Code Sandbox, it's a really cool tool. It allows you to just create React applications online that are shareable, that virtually render over here on the right, and you can add any dependencies. And Material UI, the documentation, in my opinion, is one of the best documentations I've seen, because every single example they have, they attach the Code Sandbox IO code to it. So you can click on any example you want, click on the little edit button, and it'll open up a Code Sandbox link where you can look at the code and you can even edit it. So for example, if I wanted to edit this from saying item 1, I could say like, you know, this is for YouTube. YouTube. I wonder if I spell the YouTube name wrong, if they'll like penalize me in some sort of weird algorithmic way. But anyways, you can see here that not only I don't know if you guys just saw that on the bottom right, but not only did it, you know, update it, but when you edit someone else's Code Sandbox, it will automatically fork the repository and make a new one where you can edit and you can share that around. If you have an account, which I highly recommend, everything that you edit and everything you do, you can sort of save it and go back to it. It'll automatically save it under your account, so you can see all the Code Sandboxes you've made and you've edited in the past. And I think it's a really great way to learn, which in turn, once you've sort of gone through the components and you sort of understand how it works on a basic level by playing around, and you're like, oh, okay, you can have this like tabs nested into the app bar, and you can have a tab inside of every one of them, and then they have this custom component named tab panel. Once you sort of get that understanding of a component, I recommend scrolling all the way bottom, and you will see all the actual components that they make public that you can actually download and use in your applications, and all the APIs for them. So they have a sort of list. So for tabs, you see that while, you know, the example just says tabs, there's a lot of actual tab components that go into making a full tab example. The first one is the general tab. Then you have tab context. You can use something called tab list, tab panel, the tabs, tab scroll button, and you can go ahead and click on every single one of them, and each one of these components represents something new that you would be able to import into your application. So in this simple example, they're importing tabs and tab, and you can go to the API for each one of these components and see what they are and how they are different from each other, and as well as all the props. So the props are really good to read through because it gives you an idea of what is customizable for each component. And this was really helpful for me because I use Material UI for a lot of my consulting work that I do for a lot of different companies. And sometimes the UX team will come to us and they're like, okay, I know we're using Material UI, but can we make this, you know, tabs component look like this? And it'll look like something that is not really attainable. And what I'll do is I'll go through this API documentation for the component, and I'll be like, okay, there's no specific props that allow me to edit what they're asking for. Are there any CSS overrides for what they're asking for? And it's like, okay, this text color secondary, they want it to be blue. That is something I can target with the CSS classes. So I'm going to know that that is possible. But let's say, for example, there was something in these tabs that isn't. Like, for example, maybe this little divot. I know for a fact this little divot color is customizable. But let's say, for example, it wasn't customizable. I would be able to see that from the tabs API by scrolling down and looking through the CSS rules and the props, and I could push back on UX and be like, listen, if you want if you want to use like Material UI for these tabs, which we are using, I don't think we can make it look like that because this specific element of the component isn't customizable. So we're either gonna have to use a different component, or you're going to have to change the UX designs so that we are using the color that Material UI allows or something like that. Obviously, like I said, this little orange thing is definitely customizable. I've done it before, but that was just an example of how you can use API in sort of a more workplace why knowing the API in a workplace environment can be very useful, and also just for your general knowledge. That is how I would go about using the documentation. Now let's look at some other useful things in the documentation. One other useful thing I like to look at is the default theme. So if you're still new to Material UI, you might not have watched like my theme video and stuff like that, but I highly recommend watching it. I think it's number 6. And I also talk a bit about it in number 3 as well. But pretty much in Material UI, just a TLDR, you can customize the theme, which in turn will change every component that you use, which is one of the most beautiful aspects of using Material UI. I would only recommend it if you're making like a bigger application that has its own real theme. If you're just trying to learn Material UI, other than for the learning sake of it, which could just be playing around with a couple values in your use theme, I wouldn't worry too much about it or spend too much time doing it. I would probably primarily focus on just like getting the components down first before diving into it. But if you're making an application, this is for a client or a consulting job, or you're making like a really nice website that you want and it has its own, color scheme and everything like that, the default theme documentation is really useful to know. Pretty much all you have to do is type in default. All you have to do is type in default theme, and the first result will bring you here. And what you have here is pretty much all the different objects that are nested inside the Material UI theme. And it's really important to sort of get a good idea of this because there's so many things you can change. Now, the main ones that I've dealt with are breakpoints, palette, typography, and spacing. Spacing, you're not going to have to worry about too much, but if we look at breakpoints, you can see here, I can click values and it will show me, and this is especially helpful if you're using Grid a lot, it will show you what every single breakpoint is set to, and you can even edit it. These are the standard breakpoints for most web applications, which is, it goes from the largest and up, which is 1920 pixels, and then, large is categorized as 1280 to 1920, medium is categorized as 960 to 1280, and I think anything under small is considered to be mobile view. But yeah, these values are really useful to know. You can even edit them if you want to. I don't think I've ever had to edit them before, but if that's something for your specific application that makes sense, go for it. The next thing to look at is palette. So this is where you're going to be, number one, getting all the default colors for. So for example, a lot of the colors, if I even go to tabs, let's see, do they have, so for example, they have a text color prop here, indicator color. So this indicator color is actually, funnily enough, that color that was on the tab over there, that orange. You'll see here that when you look at the props for it, it'll show either primary or secondary. Well, if you're new to Material UI, you're going to be like, what the heck is primary and secondary? And the answer is Material UI has a bunch of colors in their theme preset, and all these colors are preset. So for example, if I click the primary object under palette, you'll see here that the main is this hex code for this sort of blue color, and we can see that that is actually what this color is. That is the primary color. And then the next thing, and by the way, all these palettes are overrideable, so you can change the sort of theme. And a lot of these components use those sort of theme coloring. So once you change the palette, your application will look almost completely different. And like I said, the last thing I want to talk about within the default theme is sort of typography. You can see here, and I have a whole video on how to override these typography styles. But just a big TLDR is that there are a bunch of different typography variants. There's H1 all the way to H6, sort of just like in regular HTML. And all of these can be overwritten in terms of font family, the weight, so the boldness of it, the size of it, the line height, and the letter spacing. So those are the really important things to know are a part of the default theme. Now, the last thing I want to leave you guys with in terms of Material UI tips is really the idea, and I know this sounds really counterintuitive, but Googling is a really good resource when it comes to Material UI. And I know this sounds obvious, but the reason I'm bringing this up is because a lot of the comments that get left on the videos are just questions that I think I appreciate the comments obviously because it really helps with the YouTube algorithm, but they're questions that I think if they were typed into Google instead of like YouTube, because YouTube only has like very specific videos on specific things, so it's really hard to find debugging answers on there. But if you looked it up on Google, you would see a ton of answers on either Stack Overflow or GitHub. Now, if we go to the Material UI GitHub, Material UI is completely open source, so you can see pretty much everything on there. There are a ton of different issues that are up here, and you can find almost any answer as a beginner you have for a Material UI component, either here or on just Google with Stack Overflow. One of the best things about Material UI is that it's such a commonly used framework. I honestly wanted to try becoming a contributor to Material UI myself because of how much I love it and I appreciate it and I want to give back, but I've never contributed to anything on GitHub in my life, so I figured I might as well just stick to making videos about it or something instead. But you can find a lot of answers on here. If you need any help or support, the devs are highly responsive. I highly recommend just creating a GitHub issue if and only if you can't find an answer online to your question, or if the question hasn't been asked before and resolved, because I know a lot of developers, when it comes to open source projects, for their projects, get a bit cranky if a lot of people ask the same question over and over again, especially if it's a basic one that you could have just found the answer to on Google. But that's about it for this video. I hope I didn't miss anything. If I did, leave it in the comments, and if I missed a lot and there's a lot of unanswered questions, I might do a part 2. But yeah, I'd love to hear your general opinions on the direction I should take my channel in after Material UI. Like I said, I'm leaning towards the idea of going into a bunch of React tutorials and sort of trying to do a React series, an introductory React series, with all the newest updates, because like I said, the most common ones are pretty outdated at this point. React's a big library, they're moving fast, so I have no doubt, even if I make a video on it today, that in 2 or 3 years that might be outdated. I might have to release a new one. But yeah, let me know in the comments, and thank you all again for your amazing support in this Material UI series. I might still post a couple Material UI videos here and there, but like I said, looking to diversify what I'm making videos on. So thank you again for your support. Hope everyone's staying safe and have an amazing day.